My parents stared at my wedding seating chart for less than 10 seconds before my mother slammed it onto the table. "Move your grandfather," she snapped. "He's a retired janitor. He'll embarrass this family sitting at the head table." Grandpa quietly smiled and told me not to argue, but I refused. My parents walked out of the rehearsal dinner, promising they wouldn't attend the wedding unless I changed my mind. I thought that was the worst moment of my life. I was wrong, because during the reception, my father's CEO stood up, looked straight at Grandpa, spoke just 4 words, and my father's entire world collapsed. "My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and until my wedding rehearsal, I truly believed every family had at least one person who reminded everyone what unconditional love looked like. For me, that person was my grandfather. Everyone called him Grandpa Henry. To the world, he was a retired school janitor who had spent 40 years sweeping hallways, fixing broken lockers, and unlocking classroom doors before sunrise. But to me, he was the man who never missed a birthday, every school play, or a single important moment in my life. He taught me that dignity wasn't found in a paycheck. It was found in how you treated people when nobody was watching. Unfortunately, my parents never saw him that way, especially my father. Dad had spent the last 20 years climbing the corporate ladder at one of the largest technology companies in Chicago. Promotions, business dinners, country club memberships. His entire life revolved around status. Mom wasn't much different. She cared about appearances more than almost anything else. Whenever Grandpa visited, she would quietly hide his worn work boots near the back door or suggest he wear a newer jacket because, as she often whispered, people notice these things. Grandpa always smiled as though he hadn't heard her. He never argued, never complained. He simply kept loving us. When Daniel and I started planning our wedding, there was only one request I made before choosing flowers, music, or even the venue. "I want Grandpa sitting beside us at the head table." Daniel smiled immediately. "I was hoping you'd say that." He adored Grandpa almost as much as I did. That simple decision felt obvious. At least it did until the rehearsal dinner. The ballroom buzzed with laughter as relatives found their seats, and the wedding coordinator handed everyone printed seating charts. I noticed Dad studying his copy. Then his expression hardened. "What is this?" he asked. The room grew quieter. He walked toward me, holding the seating chart like it was evidence in a courtroom. "Grandpa is sitting here?" he demanded, pointing directly at the head table. "Yes," I answered calmly. "He's sitting with us." Mom stepped beside him. "Emily, please tell me this is temporary."
"No."
Dad laughed once, but there wasn't a trace of humor in it. "My CEO is attending this wedding." "I know. So, you're putting a retired janitor beside the bride and groom?" The conversations around us stopped completely. I could feel dozens of relatives pretending not to listen. I took a slow breath. "I'm putting my grandfather beside me." Dad lowered his voice. "People will assume he's one of the honored guests." "He is." Mom folded her arms. "Emily, think about how this looks. It looks like the man who helped raise me is sitting exactly where he belongs." Dad's jaw tightened. "You don't understand how business works." "No," I replied. "I understand how family works." His face turned bright red. "He's an embarrassing retired janitor." The words echoed through the ballroom. Every sound disappeared. I slowly turned toward Grandpa. He had heard every word. Yet instead of looking hurt, he simply smiled at me with the same gentle expression he'd worn my entire life. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said quietly. "I can sit anywhere." I walked across the room until I was standing beside him. Then I took his hand.
"No."
He looked surprised. "You'll sit beside me." Dad slammed the seating chart onto the nearest table. "If he stays at that head table, your mother and I won't be attending this wedding." Mom nodded without hesitation. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide." Neither of them waited for an answer. They grabbed their coats and walked straight out of the ballroom while every guest watched in stunned silence. The heavy doors closed behind them with a deep thud that seemed to shake the entire room. No one spoke. Grandpa gently squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry this happened because of me." I looked into his tired eyes and felt my heart break. "It didn't happen because of you. I whispered. It happened because they forgot what kind of man you really are. At that moment, I had no idea that by refusing to move Grandpa's chair, I had just set the stage for a wedding reception that none of us would ever forget. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents walking out of the rehearsal dinner while Grandpa quietly blamed himself. By sunrise, my phone had 12 missed calls. Every one of them was from Mom. I already knew what she wanted. Still, I answered the 13th call. "Emily," she said without even saying good morning, "have you fixed the seating chart?"
No.
A long silence followed. Finally, Dad's voice came onto the speaker. "This is your last chance." My answer hasn't changed. He sighed impatiently. "Then your mother and I won't be there." The line went dead. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the phone. Daniel wrapped his arms around my shoulders. "You okay?" I nodded, even though I wasn't. "They're really not coming." He kissed my forehead. "Then we'll marry surrounded by the people who actually want to celebrate us." Those words carried me through the morning. When I arrived at the venue, I couldn't stop glancing toward the entrance. Part of me kept hoping my parents would walk in smiling, ready to leave the argument behind. Every time the doors opened, it was another guest, never them. Then I saw Grandpa. He was wearing the same dark gray suit he'd bought years earlier for my college graduation. It had been carefully pressed, and his shoes shined so brightly I could almost see my reflection. He smiled when he saw me. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." "So do you," I replied, making him laugh. I think that's the first time anyone's ever said that to an old janitor. I squeezed his arm. "I've never thought of you as just a janitor." His eyes softened. "I know." The ceremony began exactly on time. As I walked down the aisle, one empty row caught my attention. The 2 seats reserved for my parents remained untouched. It hurt more than I expected. But when I looked at Grandpa sitting proudly in the front row, smiling through tears, I remembered why I had made my decision. And I never questioned it again. The ceremony was beautiful. For a little while, I forgot everything else.
People laughed. People cried.
Daniel and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. When everyone applauded, it felt like hope had returned. The reception started an hour later. Music filled the ballroom. Guests found their tables, while servers carried dinner plates across the room. Grandpa was sitting exactly where he'd been during the rehearsal, at the head table, right beside us. He looked slightly uncomfortable with all the attention, but he never complained. Halfway through dinner, the ballroom doors opened. A tall man in an elegant navy suit walked inside with 2 colleagues. Conversations immediately became quieter. I recognized him from the engagement party photographs Dad had proudly shown everyone months earlier. It was Richard Lawson,
Dad's CEO.
the founder of the company where Dad had worked for almost 25 years. Even without my parents there, he had chosen to attend. He greeted several guests before making his way toward our table. Daniel stood to welcome him. "So glad you could make it." "I wouldn't have missed it," Richard replied warmly. After congratulating both of us, his eyes slowly moved toward Grandpa.
He stopped walking.
For several long seconds, he simply stared. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then to unmistakable emotion. Without saying another word, he walked around the head table. Every guest watched him. The entire ballroom became strangely quiet. Richard stopped directly in front of Grandpa. His hands trembled slightly. Then he reached forward and shook Grandpa's hand with both of his. His voice cracked as he spoke only 4 words. "You saved my life." The room froze. Forks stopped moving. Music faded into silence. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. My grandfather looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry," Grandpa said gently. "Have we met before?" Richard smiled through tears. "Oh, Henry, I've waited 30 years to thank you." And in that single moment, every person in the ballroom leaned forward, desperate to hear what came next. The ballroom remained completely silent. Grandpa looked at Richard Lawson with genuine confusion. "I'm sorry," Grandpa repeated softly. "I think you have me confused with someone else." Richard smiled, wiping tears from the corner of his eyes. "No, sir. I could never forget your face." He turned toward the guests before looking back at Grandpa. "When I was 16 years old, my father died unexpectedly. My mother was too sick to work, and we lost our apartment within months." His voice became quieter. "I was sleeping in an abandoned car a few blocks from Lincoln High School." Several guests exchanged shocked glances. "I went to school every day pretending everything was normal because I was too embarrassed to ask for help." He looked directly at Grandpa. "Every morning, before anyone else arrived, you unlocked the school." Grandpa's eyes widened slightly. Richard continued, "You noticed I always came early. You never asked questions. You never made me feel ashamed." Instead, he smiled. "You simply handed me breakfast." Grandpa slowly lowered his head. Richard laughed softly through his tears. "You told me growing teenagers shouldn't start the day hungry. I knew you were paying for those breakfasts yourself." Grandpa shook his head. "It wasn't much. It was everything," Richard answered. He paused before continuing. "When winter arrived, you somehow found a winter coat that fit perfectly. I later discovered you'd bought it with your own money. You even left it in the janitor's office, so I wouldn't feel embarrassed accepting it." The room had become completely still. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Richard smiled at Grandpa. "You didn't just feed me. You encouraged me. When I failed a math exam, you told me one bad day never decides a person's future. When I wanted to quit school, you refused to let me. You told me to keep showing up. So I did." He turned toward every guest in the ballroom. "I graduated. I earned scholarships. I built my first business. And eventually, I founded Lawson Technologies." A wave of quiet applause began spreading through the room. Richard raised his hand.
Please.
"You don't applaud me." He looked back at Grandpa. "You applaud the man who refused to give up on a scared teenager everyone else ignored." The applause returned. This time it was louder. People rose from their chairs one by one. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Grandpa looked overwhelmed. "I never expected any of this," he whispered. Richard smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a small framed photograph. "I've carried this for years." It showed an old school hallway. Standing beside a freshly polished floor was a much younger Grandpa Henry, smiling with a mop resting against his shoulder. "I found this in the school's archives after I became successful." Richard handed the photograph to Grandpa. "Whenever people ask me where I learned leadership, I show them this picture. Because my greatest mentor never sat in a corner office. He carried a ring of keys." Tears filled Grandpa's eyes. "I don't know what to say." Richard gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already said everything that mattered. You said it every morning. You chose kindness over judgment." Just then, the ballroom doors slowly opened. My parents stood frozen at the entrance, having rushed there after hearing what had happened. Every guest instinctively turned toward them. My father looked from Richard to Grandpa, then lowered his eyes in silent shame. Grandpa noticed them immediately. Instead of anger, he simply smiled and walked over. Without hesitation, he embraced both of them. "I've never wanted an apology," he said quietly. "I only hoped one day you'd understand that no honest job can ever diminish a person's worth." No one spoke. The silence itself carried the lesson. As Daniel gently took my hand beneath the table, I realized something I'll never forget. That day, our wedding wasn't remembered for the flowers, the music, or the empty chairs. It was remembered because one humble retired janitor reminded an entire room that character will always outshine status, and that the greatest legacy any person can leave behind is the life they quietly change in someone else.